Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brandon. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Rachel Kousser and her book, Alexander at the End of the World. For those of you who know me, ancient history is usually not something I'm into. There's just not enough story. There's not enough this. There's not enough that. I still read it. I still think it can be fantastic. And luckily, Rachel's book is one of those. It's about Alexander in the kind of final years of his life that usually isn't covered by other books because there's just more exciting this, more exciting that. This book is awesome. I picked it up and I'm like, I'll give it a try. And I could barely put it down. It is that good. It reads like a movie. I don't know how to explain it. I just know Rachel nailed it. I'm going to shut up. Let's do it. And here we are with author Rachel Kousser. Alexander at the End of the World, The Forgotten Final Years of Alexander the Great. Rachel, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask this question. I've looked at the other books that you've done, and I'd say they're a bit more on the academic side, whereas this seems more of a popular history. What made you decide Alexander is going to be where I'm really going to jump into the very deep end of the pool?
Yeah, so it was actually my students who got me interested in this story. I teach at the City University of New York, and whenever I got to Alexander, my students were transfixed. There were exotic locales, there were epic battles, there was sexual intrigue. It was like a real life Game of Thrones. And they loved it. So they related to it, sort of on a fun level, but I think on a more personal level, it resonated with them because this is a story about a young man trying to navigate a world that's much more complicated than the world he grew up in. And they too were people, CUNY students are coming from all over the world to New York City, and that really resonated for them. So that's how I got into it. Why I decided to write it, I wrote 2 books for, with university presses to, work my way through the academic system, through tenure and promotion. And then I was like, you know what? I'd like to write a book for a public audience that lots of people will read. And that's been a lot of fun.
Yes, because when you have to write books for tenure, they're very often, let's say, very specific to something, and you don't really kind of get to spread your wings as much, right?
Yeah, a lot of it is about telling a story and thinking about people who don't necessarily have any background, making it something that they would be interested in. So talking about, not just the footnotes of Alexander, but like he's meeting naked Indian yogis, he's fighting elephants, that kind of stuff. It's way more fun.
And now, I've never said this on the podcast before, probably because it's bad form and I shouldn't admit this. I love all of history, but if the 1 out of 10 for me is anything American Revolution, I do have to admit on the other side of the scale to 1 is anything kind of ancient history.
So you're not one of the guys that thinks about the Roman Empire at least once a day?
Incorrect. I still do that. It's just I don't read books about it necessarily. Those 2 entirely different things.
Fair enough.
This book, I saw it and I'm kind of like, every time I read an ancient history book, I get burned. Because especially when you're talking about something like the Roman Empire, I've always found you almost have to have a doctorate in the Roman Empire to understand what's going on. But this book kept just popping up everywhere I looked, and I'm like, I'm going to give it a shot. Why not? And I absolutely love this. It's not academic. Like you said, even just the way you're talking right now, and I think the listeners can hear it, there's exciting stuff in here. And I think you keyed in on this is what people want to read about. Is that kind of what you were going for?
Absolutely. I love the ancient world. The American Revolution, I like that too. But, the ancient world is where I have spent my mature life as a scholar and as a learner. And I love it. And I want people to understand why it matters today and why the kinds of things that Alexander was dealing with, like trying to forge a multicultural empire from people with very disparate languages and religions and cultures, like that's something we're still dealing with today. And I wanted people to see those connections that I think are so powerful and to be able to reflect on our world differently, seeing it refracted through this ancient lens.
Now, I want to do something that's absolutely obnoxious for a professor like yourself. I'm going to ask a binary question that should not be binary. Is he the greatest military leader of all time? People say it. Some people say he's not. Where do you fall?
So I would say he's certainly one of the greatest, given that he creates an empire. By the time he dies, it is bigger than the Roman Empire at its height. It is the largest lifetime empire, save that of Genghis Khan. And one should say, Genghis Khan lived into his 60s. Alexander dies at 32.
It's a baby. That's a baby.
Which is enough to give us all, including Julius Caesar, an inferiority complex. He is a brilliant military leader. He's personally brave. He's charismatic. He's brilliant at fighting battles. He's brilliant at a kind of creative, resilient problem solving. But what I think maybe puts him over the top for me, and obviously I'm kind of partisan, is he is also able, at least in his final years, to recognize when a military solution is not possible and to pursue other means. And I think that that is very rare in somebody who is a great military strategist, but to me is one of the things that makes him interesting and compelling as a character.
I really appreciate, and it's in the subtitle, his forgotten years. This is not a full biography of him. You give enough in the background to understand kind of where he came from. When you say his final forgotten years, what dates are we actually talking about, and why did you decide to focus on this time frame?
Right. So the book opens in 330 BCE when he's this kind of young, implausibly successful man who, after over the course of the previous 3 years, has conquered and created what is the first European empire in the Middle East. And everyone's kind of expecting him to cash in, go home. But instead, he heads east to the Persian Empire's eastern borderlands, hoping to reach the end of the world. And the next 7 years of his life, the part that I'm covering, are this epic wild ride, where, as I say, he's fighting elephants and he's marrying 3 times. Macedonian kings are polygamous. He has wild successes, but also buries his closest friend. And these years are often, I think, treated as a kind of degenerate aftermath of a once promising career. But in my mind, and that's a lot because he messes up, he fails, and then he figures to try something else, and then he fails again, and then he tries something else. And to me, that's what's interesting about him. That's what's compelling. It's really only in those years when he's sort of facing challenges in Afghanistan and South Asia that makes him great, and that he becomes great when the empire strikes back.
The way you write it in the book, it's almost like this is the point where his drive outstrips everyone else that is with him. Like you said, that everyone else is kind of like, hey, we did it. Mission accomplished. Let's go on home. And he's like, we're not at the ocean yet, which I do love that it's like ocean. Ocean. We have not reached ocean yet. And because, of course, they're not sure which ocean. What are we talking about? Is it even named? We don't know. But his drive, even at this point, is, I have not conquered everything yet. Is it drive? Should we call it sociopathy? Like, what is driving him at this point?
I think part of it is he sees, there's the part he knows and the part he doesn't know. So the part he knows, when my book starts, he hasn't gotten to the edge of the Persian Empire. He's nowhere near it. He's still 1,500 miles from the eastern border of the Persian Empire. And he, much more than his officers or his second in command, realizes that unless he gets further and really wipes out resistance, any conquests he has are always going to be vulnerable. So part of it is that pragmatic thing, but there is also this kind of, fascination with the unknown and a real difficulty stopping. And the things he doesn't know, like Aristotle, his tutor, had told him, like, you will get to this ocean at the end of the world. You can see it from the Hindu Kush Mountains, and there will be monsters there. It will be fascinating. And, I think he's sort of looking for something that is a clear stopping point, that even he would have to acknowledge that way. He never finds it.
the details that you go through, you forget about this when you're just sitting there reading a book about a military campaign, that basically every step you take, you're losing more of your resources, whether they're people, food. And he was just in, we don't know what the heck is going on land. Basically, wherever he went, he was beyond what was known. Is this a situation where kind of we talk about those forgotten years where they're like, he's too far. He's driven by egomania as opposed to actually wanting something. It very much seems like in the book, you're just saying he almost doesn't know better. Like this is the life that he's lived that, and I think you almost really say it, he wouldn't know what to do if he went back home. That he doesn't understand that life. Is that kind of what you were getting at in the book?
I think he was always looking for new challenges, but it's also a JFK question. Like he dies at 32, which is still terribly young. So, would he have figured out ways to settle down? Would he have found ways to, find new ways to use his tremendous energy, his tremendous resources? Possibly, if he had grown up and matured. I think you can see even within his lifetime, a real trajectory between the ages of, say, 25 and 32 in ways I get into more in the book. But where he would have become, that's still a mystery to us. And it's kind of an imponderable one.
He made some really bold choices strategically, whether it's in battle or even just moving his armies around. Which one stood out the most to you? Or you could also answer, which one was the most fun to dig into and then write up?
That's a good question. I loved writing about South Asia, his invasion there. I think partly because that's where the Greeks are going somewhere. The Greeks and Macedonians are going somewhere they have no idea what it's like. I mean, the Persian Empire, they had been fighting for 200 years. They had they'd been invaded by the Persians twice. They had some concept of what Persia was like. But they thought there were gold digging ants and people with one foot. I mean, they were wild ideas. And their sort of discovery of the reality has this kind of fascination to it. Like they are thrilled by everything. Apparently, they marvel at what they call wool that grows on trees. That's cotton. They marvel at the fact that Indians dye their beards grass green. They think Indians are taller, healthier, and more beautiful than the Greeks were, as well as less litigious, which is probably true. So there's just this kind of, fascination with seeing Alexander and his men come into this world that is so different from their own and try to make sense of it. And they do so in this open-minded way that's rather different. With the Persians, they've been invaded by them. They really don't like the Persians, and they have a very hard time kind of dealing with them with any respect. But there's this one moment where Alexander is in Taxila, this city in what's now Pakistan, and there are these wise men, and he sends one of his friends, his helmsman, a guy named Onesicritus, who happens to be not only a naval commander, but also has a real interest in philosophy. And he sends him to go talk to the wise men, the Indian wise men. And Onesicritus goes, he has to bring like 3 translators with him. And he asks about their philosophy, and they explain their philosophy to him while doing what seems to be very weird yoga in the sun. And he reports it with great sort of respect and enthusiasm. And you really see a moment where there seems to be a kind of mutual, a sort of touching of 2 very different people in a really thoughtful and respectful way. And that is kind of fascinating to me.
As long as Alexander isn't trying to kill you,
yeah.
He seems progressive. Now, that's a big, but right there.
It's
or
a but,
if.
Yeah. Yes.
I personally like, just because we do know more about it, especially as Americans, we know how mountainous Afghanistan is. But the thought of wrapping your head around, you have this gigantic army, and all of a sudden you're running into these mountains, and you're like, oh, let's just keep going. Let's just keep going. I'm sure there's no other mountains on the other side of these huge mountains. I'm sure it's all just downhill from there. But he has to make all these impossible choices. Something else that he has to do consistently is, I was just fighting with that guy, but I'm going to leave that guy in charge while I keep going. It sounds insane, but it was also almost the only way for him to continue doing what he was doing, right? Which was somebody that's an enemy today is now my backup tomorrow, right?
Yeah, and I think there is a way in which one of the underappreciated things that Alexander was good at that made his conquest so effective. And you have to imagine, he's got an army that, depending on the time, ranges between 30 to 50,000 people, and the Persian Empire has maybe 30 million people. So that's a tiny fraction. So one of the things he's surprisingly good at is figuring out how to cut deals and co-opt local leaders. And he does so very effectively by really giving them a high degree of trust and being willing to work with people, who, he's fighting them in battle in 1 month, and the next month they've submitted, they've given hostages, and he's like, okay, here you are, now you're governor, you're in charge again. You're under me, but you're in charge again. And I think he was leaving a lot of the command structure in place. And the Persian Empire had a very sophisticated administrative system, governmental system. And so part of Alexander's brilliance is not destroying that and not trying to nation build, but using it to make his own conquest more effective.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe like Genghis Khan, like Napoleon, that was something that a lot of we'll say the biggest conquerors did, was if you don't get in my way, if you don't put up a fight, yesterday is going to be the same as today. It's just now I'm in charge, but here's all your people back. That seems to be a very effective across time, that if you leave a lot of what is already there in place, it makes it easier for people to say, okay, fine, you're in charge now. Go on to your next conquest. We'll see you later.
Absolutely. And I think Alexander is brilliant at that. And he doesn't always make the right decision in ways we talk about in the book more. But, there are some people he trusts and his trust is misplaced. But broadly speaking, it works out well for him. And it's striking to the extent to which he does it. There's this 4-year period when he names 11 governors. There are about 20 governors of, in the entire Persian Empire. He names 11 of them, and 10 are Persian. So that is a really large percentage, and it really suggests a sort of willingness to work within their system rather than to try and impose one top down of his own.
Now, at this point, this strategy does, and maybe it's happened the whole time, but especially in the book, it does start to grate on his own people a little bit, because now he's conquering these places, but he's leveraging more of the local leaders. So all of his men that are thinking, I'm next up to be governor somewhere, is this where we first start seeing those cracks, or were they earlier than this?
They're certainly intensified in the period of his forgotten final years, the period I'm studying. There are little cracks before then where there's some sense that they think he's being a little too merciful to Persians, but it really intensifies, as his own ambitions intensify to become the legitimate great king of Persia. He does things like he starts wearing, it's not fully Persian clothes, but he wears some things that are Persian. He marries 3 Iranian wives. He even tries at one point to get all his followers, Macedonian and Persian, to do this thing called proskynesis, which is a kind of bowing ritual. That's the way the Persians greet a great king. And he tries to get his Macedonian followers to do it, and they completely rebel. They think that is like, the height of, chutzpah for him to say, you should be acting the way the people that you conquered are behaving. And I think that you start to see these really strong tensions erupt between the army he comes with and the people he is sort of newly kind of co-opting and trying to work with.
Rachel, are you trying to tell me that, politically speaking, sometimes people will make a huge deal out of a very small thing? Thank God we've grown out of that, right?
I would say that symbolic things matter to a lot of people, whether or not there's any real, the symbolism matters.
There's a huge part in this book, and I'm thinking about it now, and I kind of, for the reader's sakes, I don't want to get too deep into it, but there is a breaking point where basically Alexander gets talked into turning around. I won't go too deep into that because I think it's such a good part of the book. I don't want to ruin it for anybody. But he finally gets talked into turning around. And what struck me about this is almost any other leaders, that turning point isn't being talked into it. It's somebody puts a blade to your throat, whether metaphorically or literally, and says, we're turning around, like you're not in charge anymore. Even at this point, when his men were kind of done with it, they still had such a complete and utter respect and reverence for him that it looks a lot different than it would for a lot of other military leaders, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny, I was writing this chapter during the summer of 2020 and thinking a lot about political protest and how leaders respond to it. And I was like, what's striking about this is that, he wants to keep going further east. His men finally say no, and he backs down. And he does so, he doesn't push it. He decides to listen to them. He probably didn't like it, but he does it with no loss of life and no violence and comparatively graciously. And I think that ability to kind of reverse course and listen to people is a really admirable quality in a political leader. It's not one that people tend to associate with Alexander the Great, shall we say. They think of him as this kind of swashbuckling, pillaging jerk. But actually, I think he had some understanding of the limits of his power and when to hold them and when to fold them.
It's just one example of what you're saying is that, yes, militarily, I don't think there's a lot of people that can argue that he's not up there. But politically speaking, you have it all over the book. This is not just one instance where this is how I'm going to play it. He seems to constantly be one step ahead, if not two, of everyone he runs into.
Absolutely. One of the things that made him so effective as a military leader, but also as a political leader, is his ability to put himself in the place of somebody else and anticipate not only what they're thinking, but what they're thinking he's going to do, and then does something else in response. And that is a very unusual talent, especially to have with people that you've never met and who might be your enemies. So for example, in the big battle that I go into in more detail in my book, one of the striking things about this, he's facing this great South Asian king, a guy named Porus. And Alexander really considers this his most impressive battle because he's fighting elephants. Porus has a big bunch of elephants. And Alexander's trying to figure out how to neutralize that threat. So the first thing he does, he and Porus are lined up there facing one another. And Alexander decides instead of attacking the elephants first, which might be the typical thing, he's going to attack Porus's cavalry, his horsemen, with Alexander's own cavalry, which is better. So Porus sees that this is what's going to happen. And he pulls part of his cavalry that's on the other side. Usually you have the cavalry flanking the infantry in your army on the sides to protect them. He pulls the cavalry from one side all the way back around the rest of his army to reinforce that cavalry. But Alexander has already figured out that he's going to do this. And he has told before the battle starts, remember, there's no walkie-talkies or cell phones here. So he's already told the commander of the cavalry on the other side, if Porus does this, you follow him around with your cavalry. And they encircle Porus's army. And as Porus suddenly realizes that, we got people in the back of us as well as the front of us, and he tries to turn his cavalry around to face both of them at once, then Alexander strikes. And he just decimates that cavalry. And that is a brilliant, it pretty much, the battle was downhill from there for poor Porus. But it's also like a brilliant ability to foresee, almost like chess, but playing chess 10 moves ahead in a very fast moving game. It's astonishing.
I mean, this is wonderful and very scholarly, so I want to ruin this. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is the Alexander movie with Colin Farrell?
Oh, I don't like to diss anything that...
That's a 1, listeners. You can't see her face. She's saying 1 in her head. I can see it.
I'm psyched if it drew people to Alexander. And there are many Oliver Stone movies that I think are great. But this was not my favorite Oliver Stone movie, let's put it this way. Or my favorite Colin Farrell movie.
Now, there is a newer Netflix Alexander documentary. Yes. Were you able to see that one? How did you feel about that one?
Oh, totally. I was so down. I'm fascinated. Yeah.
So they got a lot more right in that one probably then.
Yeah, I mean, I think they got a lot of things right that I really liked. They did a very smart job with Alexander's sexuality, for example, and explaining that in, I thought, a very nuanced way. Where I wasn't so thrilled was with their treatment, their sort of almost their visual representation. So Alexander in this movie is blonde, very blue-eyed, which the only images we have of him in color, he has brown hair, brown eyes, totally different. And the Persians are very, I think Elizabeth Taylor and Cleopatra, kind of very orientalized. And that part in the sort of historical recreation sections. And that part made me a bit uncomfortable because I felt like they had done more justice to Alexander as a person, but I felt as though their characterization of the Persians was still a little bit stereotyped in ways that didn't love.
I was on Twitter when it came out just because I wanted to see, some people, and it was quite funny that they made him gay. And I think every person who has ever read a book said he was always gay. That was bisexual. But they didn't make that up. That was definitely a thing.
Absolutely. I wouldn't say gay. I would say, and I think that they did a pretty good job explaining it in the Netflix documentary, that he, like many men of his time, he slept with women. He had 3 wives and at least 1 mistress, whom I discuss more in the book. He also slept most likely with men, including his closest friend and companion, Hephaestion. And both of those things were totally normal for his time and period. And I think that the details are quite spicy, but they're also really well authenticated. They are just, what fascinates me about the ancient world is that categories we have, like gay or straight, completely don't apply.
Is the hardest part being an author dealing with this time period, having to retype all those super long names? That's got to be just obnoxious.
They are really long. I mean, I realize my students trip over them and they're frustrating. I mean, Alexander is one that sort of lasted, so we could say that. Parmenion does not go as trippingly off the tongue. But I think that one of the things I really like about this period is that it's so different that it reminds me of everything I'm taking for granted being, things I'm taking for granted rather than reality. So long names, weird customs. That's one of the things that I think is fascinating to me about the ancient world.
Speaking of the ancient world, I become magic and I send you back. You can now talk to one person from your book. I'm excluding Alexander. That's too easy. Yeah. You can talk to one person that is in your book. Who would it be and why?
So the person I would really love to interview above all is Alexander's Greco-Persian mistress, Barsine. She's this fascinating character, and I really wonder what she made of her own life. Her dad's a Persian governor. Her mother's from the Greek island of Rhodes. They then run afoul of the Persian king, and they go to the man best able to protect them, who happens to be Alexander's father, Philip II. And they spend about 10 years at the court of Philip from the time Alexander is maybe 4 to 14. So he grows up with this really interesting intercultural marriage right in front of him. And he and Barsine may even have played together as children. Then the tables are turned. Her father's invited back to Persia. And a few years later, they find themselves on the other side fighting Alexander. And when Barsine meets him again, she's his captive. By this point, she's been married twice, she's been widowed twice, she has children of her own, and she's also famously beautiful and really well educated in an era when few Greek or Persian women had much education. And she enters into a relationship with Alexander. She bears the only child of his own blood that Alexander ever gets to know, a boy named Heracles, and she seems to go with him on all his travels until very close to the end of his life. So I feel as though she would have a really interesting perspective on him because she sees both the Greek side and the Persian side because she is herself both. And I'd be curious to know what she thought of him.
See, I would talk to Philip II because I'd say, all right, what do you think, kind of put that megalomaniacal thought in your son's head? Because I got a 9-year-old daughter who is very spirited and I want to cut that off now. Don't know if she's going to become a supervillain or cure cancer. Could go either way.
Yeah, I'm sure Philip thought the same thing after Alexander tamed Bucephalus, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking, right? Like, just love the spirit, but you just don't want it to overflow a bit too much where you try and take over most of the known world.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Philip probably would have been down with that. I hate to tell you. It was his idea to conquer the Persian Empire in the first place.
I mean, I'd have to talk to him very carefully so I can get what I needed without him knowing. Point
yeah,
taken,
talk
Rachel.
Carefully and drink a lot while you're doing it.
That I can do. The second part I can do. All right, so Rachel, I have to admit, this is the last question I ask authors, right? People think history is boring, it's a class and all of that stuff. And now I have to throw myself into it. I was trying to stay away from ancient history. You made me look stupid. I appreciate that. But if I sat somebody like myself in front of you and they're like, oh, man, I don't know these names. Everything's so boring. You can't even tell a story because not everything is written down about this stuff. I sat one of those people in front of you and they said, why should I read Alexander at the End of the World? What would you say?
I would say that this is a story that I'm telling right now because it resonates with right now, particularly with these questions about somebody trying to navigate a world that is multicultural and to try and make a unity of disparate languages, disparate people, disparate religions. And Alexander is dealing with questions that we are still thinking about a lot in America, but really all over because of globalization. Is one group on top? How do you balance minority groups and give them a share? How do you take military success and turn it into long-lasting, a long-lasting, stable administration? And there's this one story that I think really encapsulates a lot of this, like both the success and the failure of Alexander. So at this point, he's about 3 years into his conquest, and he's dealing with the Persian queen mother, a woman named Sisygambis. And one day he gets this shipment of wool and female weavers from Macedonia, and he's all excited. And so he sends them to Sisygambis with a message that if she and her granddaughters, the Persian princesses, like the wool, the weavers can teach them how to make more clothing. And from a Macedonian perspective, this is a great gift because everybody from queens to commoners weaves. It's the paradigmatic good thing that all good Greek and Macedonian women do. But from a Persian perspective, it looks a little different. Imagine if you're the queen and somebody sends you a mop and tells you to mop the floor. I mean, this is a huge insult from a Persian perspective because weaving is the work of servants. And so the messenger tells his disappointed Alexander, like the queen mother, she didn't like it. She's got tears in her eyes. And Alexander, to his credit, he goes to her, he apologizes. He explains that his mother and sisters made the clothes he's wearing and that he was misled by his own customs. And what we're seeing here is him in real time sort of being forced to adjust his worldview, which is pretty impressive for somebody with the kind of untrammeled political power that he has. And I think it's that ability to get outside his own worldview and see things from another perspective that makes him so compelling and so relevant for today.
Well, Rachel, you made me a believer. Thank you so much for coming on to talk.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Rachel, thank you so much. Alexander at the End of the World. It made me a believer, people. Go out and get it. You're going to love it. Hit us up, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget YouTube. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.